So if I go off the topic, Christine or Jerry, you can let me know. I'm a bit of a chancer as well. That's the other thing. Growing up in Fermanagh, I think the first thing you learn is, even though you know very little about stuff, you proclaim yourself an expert and just launch yourself into it. So here I am, doing this, but very much conscious that we're all in this together, and everybody has their own ways of coping. So anyway, just a first starting point, like the effects of this crisis are pretty serious. The effects of lockdown, obviously in the south of Ireland, is very different at the moment. You're got a very strict regime there. Up in the north, it's not quite as strict, but it looks like we're heading the same direction. But these are the problems, obviously, that the risk of the fear, the anxiety is very common. The worry about what's going to happen to me or to other people, or my job, the economy, the recession maybe coming down the line. And then this thing about mental health issues are a very real thing. The pressure is on people, and some counselors I'm talking to are telling me they're reporting a lot of uptake in business. People are really struggling. The reality of the stress, depression is around. So again, just to acknowledge the reality of that. This is where we are. This is what's happening, and these are often the kind of things that happen to us. So within that, then there's a tendency to blame, to look for someone or something to blame. So I mean, this is a bit of an exaggeration, obviously, but sometimes people blame the government. Sometimes people have these conspiracy theories. It's it's not real, or it's somebody's made this up, or it's China, that's doing this. And then there's a really subtle one that often we can blame God for this. We can say, like, maybe God sent this. It's like a plague. It's like an Old Testament plague. We've been sent, and it's been sent to clean up the world and to bring us back and all this sort of stuff. So just to say that's what happens, and to put that out of your head, because it doesn't help. And we have to be realistic. This is where we are in the middle of the pandemic. These are the effects of what's happened. The government's trying to cope with this, and we're trying to figure out a way through this. So let's get our head right, and let's put things in their right place. But there is this danger, obviously, and I know this from our own family experience, just the danger of letting things go too much, or the danger of mental health issues spiraling out of control, depression, anxiety, etc. So the danger of isolating ourselves to such an extent that we get completely cut off, or we find impossible to go on. You know what I'm talking about here? It's just to name that. Obviously that's not where we want to end up, but that is what can often happen. So our job is to do whatever we can to avoid that, to keep on track, keep ourselves in good shape, to connect with others, etc. So you guys will know this better than me. So this is the theme, just simply finding a way through. How do I find a way through? And I think for most of us, with our faith, whatever that is, and whatever we believe God to be, trying to find a way to use all of that to come together, to find some way of coping with this, find a way of dealing with a lot of difficult emotions, find a way of connecting with all these restrictions. For me, it's a bit like a pilgrimage. You're in a foreign land. This is part of the Jesuit training. You have no money. You're off in Spain. You have no Spanish, and you have to find your way across the country. And it seems impossible. And you just do it one step at a time. You just have to keep working out, where am I going to go? What step do I take next? So number one, remember there's 10 points. Number one is just simply, God is with us in the mess. It sounds really obvious, but in my experience, often what happens is people forget this. People think they're on their own. People feel that, well, it's just me, I'm having a bad time and God has left me and I have to cope on my own, etc. So that's understandable humanly that would happen, but that's not the truth of it. Obviously, God is with us in the mess, and you can see that there's a lot of good things we've seen from the lockdown, the previous lockdown, the solidarity, for example, that people looking after each other, people looking out for neighbours, people doing extraordinary things to keep going. Even here in Gardner Street, some of what you've done to try to connect to people, try to go online. The gospel choir mass, for example, is quite inspiring, just to find a way of doing things. These are all great things. And then there's the personal level as well, obviously. So the second point is that there are two forces working on us. And this is a key Ignatian point. So there is light and there is dark, just the reality of that. There's always two forces working on us. One is good and one is not good. So one is from God. That's a sense of turning to the light. And there's a sense of kind of opening ourselves. There's a sense of looking up, looking for inspiration, trusting that there's a bigger picture, trusting that there's meaning in this. And then there's the opposite. One is away from God, turning to the dark. Just the reality of that. That's what happens, you know. I've seen that in my own family. It's a tragedy to watch that. So just to acknowledge the reality of there's two forces working on us. And we have to be realistic. You can't be naive, you know. Like people say, well, it's, you know, it's only good things will happen or whatever, but life's not like that. Life is tough, and we have to learn how to separate these two things. I'm just going to go into that in a little moment. So again, this is the key Ignatian or Jesuit insight. We have to learn how to discern. And the word discern means to separate. And it's a bit like panning for gold. You see the picture here? So to get gold, you have to sift through all this dirt and muck and gravel, etc. You have to separate out the pieces of gold. So there's a process going on, and you have to identify exactly, this is the good and this is the bad. This is what I throw away and this is what I keep, you know. So that process of discernment, of separation, of being on top of things is critical. I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So signs of God, obviously, what did that look like? Well, an increase of faith, hope, and love is one thing. Being selfless, you see that? Mm-hmm. Moving towards other people. We've seen a lot of that in the first lockdown, in the pandemic. You know, people work in healthcare. My brother's a doctor, for example. The sense of community that comes out of that, the sense of connection. You know, even with the lockdown, people look for connection. People look to communicate. And then finally, feeling consoled or uplifted. These are the signs of God. And then obviously the opposite is also true. Signs of God absence, a decrease of faith, hope, and love. Selfishness. And then this thing about being isolated, you know, turning away from God, turning away from other people, locking yourself up in a room, feeling desolate, feeling empty. These are the signs of God's absence, the sign that we're going the wrong way. And remember this thing, God is always trying to communicate with us. I'm going to go into that a little bit more. God is always trying to lead us in a certain direction, obviously towards those good things that come from God. But this number 4, then, the answer is within us. And this can sound a bit odd, you know, but it's this self-knowledge, knowing oneself. This is from the Oracle. The old Greek philosophers said, know thyself is the key thing. So to acknowledge what's happening inside myself, what are my motivations, what are my emotions? Remember, we did that in the awareness exercise. What's happening inside myself, and how am I making decisions? This is the key thing, because that affects everything. That affects how I interpret the pandemic, how I find help or not, how I connect to other people or not, etc. So I have to start with myself. This is from Ignatius of Loyola. Some of you will be familiar. This is a picture of Ignatius on his home, and he was recuperating. And he was recuperating for several months because he'd shattered his legs, remember? And he had this insight. This is the whole Jesuit thing, the whole Ignatian thing is based on this one insight. And this is the insight. There were two spirits working on him. The first one, thinking of worldly matters, he found much delight initially, but after growing weary and dismissing them, he found he was dry and unhappy. So the thing there, he was thinking about some great romance. He was going to win the hand of this woman. It was really an impossible thing. In some ways, it's a bit of fantasy. It wasn't actually real. And you see that thing, initially, it felt delight. It felt great. You know, this is a brilliant thing. But afterwards, felt weary, felt dry and unhappy. So it was the looking back on it reflecting on it, that he worked out that this is not from God. Obviously, God communicates with us through our interior, inside ourselves. This is an extraordinary thing. God communicates directly with us. This is what Ignatius discovered. This is what we're trying to tune into as well. Then the second one, when he thought of imitating the saints, so this is the selfless thing. He not only found consolation, but even afterwards, he remained happy and joyful. So this is thinking about his life, thinking about his vocation. In some ways, this was a bit of an extreme thing. He was thinking about St. Francis and St. Dominic and about giving up his whole life and about eating herbs and being a pilgrim, being on the road, etc. Eventually, he worked out some of that was a bit unrealistic, but that movement, the movement away from his previous life where he'd been quite vain, he'd been a soldier, he'd been quite aggressive, he'd been full of himself, had to move away from that. God was leading him in a certain direction, and God was working in his interior. So those are the two spirits. And Ignatius called them desolation and consolation. You see that? Desolation is moving away from God, and consolation is moving towards God. So those are the two. It's not the way we would normally use those words. We use them in terms of emotions or feelings. This is a direction, moving towards God, moving away from God. And feelings are part of it, but feelings are not the whole thing, as I'm going to explain in a second. So feelings are a double-edged sword. This is number 5. So feelings are a gift from God, obviously. You know, the fact that I can feel things, that I can, you know, react to situations, that I feel love for people, that I can feel the joy of being alive. I can feel the joy of a sunrise. I can feel the gift of God's world. Even fear, anxiety are gifts from God initially, but taken to their extreme, they can be quite damaging. So this image here is an image of a pool or a water or a lake. At the top, things are choppy. So the emotions, often the superficial emotions, can be really distracting. But underneath, in the depths, there is calm and there is peace, and there is these deeper emotions that come from God and indicate which way we can reliably go. So that thing about being happy and content and being at peace, which underlies a lot of the superficial feelings. So I can be temporarily anxious, I can be temporarily distracted, I can be fearful, I can be worried, etc. But those things are not all who we are. So we have to get away from living at the surface, living just at a superficial level. Obviously, the danger is our culture is so superficial. Things like social media, they encourage us to live at that level, and they try to prevent us from going deeper. So our job is to create these spaces and to kind of rewind some of these processes that culture has built up. This here, the gap, I call it. There's always a gap between what you feel and who you are. So for example, people say, you know, I am depressed, but what they mean is I am feeling depression at this moment. So you can't identify yourself with depression or with happiness or with anxiety or with joy, etc. There's a gap between who you are and what you feel. And a lot of the meditation or awareness exercises, just like the one we just did, are about identifying the gap, getting a bit of distance from our feelings, not being at the mercy of the feelings, and getting in touch with the deeper urges, the deeper desires, the movements that are actually from God. So again, number 7, reflection on experience. Again, this is one of the cornerstones of the whole Ignatian system, creating a space where you can reflect. You see the mirror here, looking back in the mirror, everything's crystal clear. You see that? The image is really clear, but on the outside, going forward, things are blurred. Obviously, sometimes you can be moving so fast and doing so much and being busy, etc., that you're not really seeing things clear, and you get caught up in the activity. I mean, I know this myself, especially when I used to work at industry, etc., and this is what you're encouraged to do, to be efficient, to be fast, to be doing lots of things, to be involved in a huge amount of projects, etc. And often it can be great and it can feel exhilarating, but that can be just temporary, and often we miss the important things. We need to step back, we need to reflect, we need to look from a bit of a distance, a perspective, which is God's perspective, and to see things a bit more clearly. So this is the Ignatian process, if you like. See, there's the experience on the left, there's reflection in the middle, and then there's decision or acting on the right. And our job is just simply to build in that reflection. So reflection is looking back on the bottom here, looking back on our experience. So it could be looking back on the last lockdown, for example. If you think about that, think about what got you through the last lockdown. Think about what worked for you. Think about how God was working with you. Think about how you reached out to others, how you made connections, etc. And then on the top, looking forward from that point of reflection, that point of stillness, that place of depth, looking forward, trying to figure out, how am I going to get through this lockdown, for example, given what I've learned before, what might be helpful for me? You might just take a moment, consider, what kind of decisions should I make? You know, what kind of help do I need? What structure do I need? Is a very Ignatian thing. You know, what kind of structure do I need to set up for myself? So like a daily timetable. So for example, connections with other people, being part of a group, being accountable to other people, checking in with people, even getting counseling, for example, realizing I need help sometimes. Sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing when to ask for help. I know from my own life and just other family experiences. Number 8, the paradox of suffering. And this is a hard one to explain, obviously, because suffering is not a nice thing, so you don't ask for it. And obviously this time of lockdown, there's quite a bit of suffering in it, and some of it's just unavoidable, in the sense of there's real pressure in terms of work, real pressure in terms of socializing, real pressure in terms of the economy, getting out, doing things, having a social life, enjoying what you'd normally enjoy. So you can often be quite isolated. And then I don't know if you've heard this about the footprints in the sand. This guy's walking across a beach, or a woman walking across a beach, and look back, see the footprints, and think, why did you abandon me, God, when I was going through the most difficult time, this terrible lockdown time? And then God says, you don't realize you're misinterpreting. God says, that's when I carried you. There's one set of footprints because God is carrying you. So the paradox is, God is closest to us when you least feel like it. It's really quite bizarre, and it's the opposite of what you feel, so often the feelings can be unreliable, and there's a deeper reality to this. Just waiting for the next slide to come up here. Here we go. So it's related to this experience of Jesus on the cross. He says these terrible words. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those are terrible words to be saying in that situation. And remember, Jesus was completely humanly divine. He was completely human and completely divine. But here you see the humanity, and we can relate to this experience. We can relate to what it feels like to go through the valley of darkness, to have really difficult times. The secret is to do what Jesus does in order to get through, to be faithful to the prayer, to the meditation, and using the Psalms, which is what this quote is from. So those words Jesus says, he says, not my will, but your will be done. These can be really helpful in those crunch situations, to keep on track, to keep pointed in the right direction, even when everything feels like it's going the opposite direction. It's a paradox, but there is a way of dealing with that. There's a way of getting through these moments. Number 9, real prayer is two-way conversation. I often say to people, because my job is to kind of teach people about prayer and meditation, and often I say, look, if you're talking too much, then you're not listening. Our job is to listen to what God is saying to us, to what we might do. So trying to create those spaces. I mean, we can pray, we can express what's in our heart, but also we need to listen. We need to figure out what God is saying to us. Remember, I said God is always trying to communicate with us. Here's the image. It's probably the most accurate. It's a bit like a transmitter and a receiver. Think about a radio or a mobile phone. So God is the transmitter. The signal is always there. We are the receiver. We're also a transmitter, obviously. So we have to pick up the signal. Remember the old radio? You had to tune in the radio to get the signal. So our job is to tune in, to get that signal, to figure out what we could do, especially in these really difficult moments, really difficult times, when you have to manage the emotions. We have to find that deeper sense of connection. We have to find that sense of where we should be going, what we could do that would actually keep us on track, that would actually bring us into the light eventually. Sometimes there's no avoiding the valley of darkness, but at least we can walk through. We can keep focused on the light. Number 10, the last one, you always have a choice. You always have a choice about how you can live this crisis. Even if it's only accepting that it's a difficult time, even if it's accepting limitations, you have a choice about how you approach things. There is a gap between the situation, which is the lockdown, this international worldwide crisis, and how you live that. And there are things that you can do. Remember, God is inviting you to do certain things and move away from other things. You have to identify what is helpful and what's not helpful. And often it's a very personal thing. Often it can help to talk to other people about it. Often it can help to reflect, have those places of reflection, figure out what God is saying, figure out what would be helpful. So making good decisions is what it all boils down to. Trying to manage the emotion. Remember, fear or anxiety are not good counselors. They can masquerade as being really good. You know, that this is the important thing to do, and let fear dominate, and let anxiety dominate, but they will bring you to dark places. So we have to manage those. We have to get beyond the superficial emotions, get to the deeper places. Finally, this little quote from Lord of the Rings. This is Gandalf, the wizard. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you. That's it. Thank you.